The princess who spent her life in the relentless glare of the public eye died in a speeding car in Paris, apparently trying to evade pursuing photographers.
What if Princess Diana's final phone call wasn't just a goodbye, but a warning? Just hours before her tragic death, Diana reportedly spoke to King Charles, and what he said will send chills down your spine. Sources now claim Charles begged her to stay silent, warning, if you speak about Camilla, you'll blow up this family and yourself. New revelations suggest Diana was preparing to go public with explosive secrets about Camilla Parker Bowles, royal affairs, and what really happened behind palace walls. What was so dangerous, so damning, that the future king pleaded with his ex-wife to keep quiet? Stay with us as we uncover the final conversation that could have changed everything. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It was a warm, late summer evening in Paris, the city of lights cloaked in shadows. On the night of August 30th, 1997, Princess Diana of Wales made a phone call that would never be officially recorded, never be publicly acknowledged, yet it continues to reverberate through whispers, speculation, and deeply buried royal secrets. This was no ordinary conversation. According to a series of bombshell revelations recently unearthed by investigators close to the royal orbit, Diana's final private call wasn't to her sons, nor to her partner Dodi Al Fayed. It was to the man who had once vowed to love her forever, Prince Charles. And what he allegedly said that night would shock not just the world, but perhaps more critically, would expose the crumbling facade of the British monarchy itself. The call, reportedly tense and emotional, took place just hours before Diana entered the black Mercedes that would become her final resting place in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. It was a conversation fueled by fear, desperation, and the looming threat of exposure. Diana, according to insiders, was ready to speak out. She had long grown tired of being silent, tired of watching the very institution that had hollowed out her spirit continue to polish its image while she bore the brunt of its lies. And she had secrets that could shake Buckingham Palace to its gilded foundations. Chief among them, the full extent of Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, and the disturbing political, financial, and even moral compromises that, if made public, could spell ruin for the royal family. But Charles allegedly begged her, implored her, not to say a word. If you speak about Camilla, he reportedly warned her, you'll blow up this family, and yourself. The language wasn't subtle. The undertone wasn't veiled. It was a direct warning, perhaps even a threat. And Diana, known for her courage, reportedly did not back down easily. The call, we're told, escalated into a desperate back and forth. One last storm between a man clinging to the image of monarchy and a woman determined to expose its rot. To understand the full weight of this call, we need to step back, because it didn't come out of nowhere. This was the culmination of years of betrayal, psychological warfare, and institutional cruelty. Diana had long been labeled the people's princess, but inside the royal machine, she was seen very differently. She was a liability, a wild card, a media darling who couldn't be controlled. Her charisma, once a tool of the firm, had become a weapon she wielded independently. And as she grew bolder in her post-divorce public life, rumors began to swirl that she had compiled a dossier, a collection of audio tapes, documents, and statements from those who had seen the cracks in the royal armor firsthand. Some say she intended to release this material in an explosive televised interview, one that would eclipse even her landmark BBC Panorama interview with Martin Bashir. Others believe she was working with trusted journalists to serialize the story and drip-feed the revelations to maximize their impact. Whichever version is true, one thing remains constant. Diana was ready to detonate the truth. And that's precisely what terrified Prince Charles. This wasn't just about Camilla Parker Bowles, though Diana had often said she felt her marriage was crowded from the start. It was about the monarchy itself, the cold machinery behind the crown. Diana had grown up in aristocratic circles. She knew the etiquette. But after marrying into royalty, she witnessed something darker. The manipulation, the cover-ups, the silencing of dissent. She had seen how courtiers leaked stories to the press to damage her image. She had heard firsthand from insiders about financial dealings that would make headlines if they ever surfaced. And crucially, she had experienced the emotional toll of an institution that prized survival over humanity. When she called Charles that night, it wasn't to seek reconciliation. It wasn't to apologize. It was, in many ways, her final declaration of war. But war with the royal family is never fought in the open. It's waged through subtle sabotage, veiled threats, and quiet erasure. Diana knew this, and Charles knew she was willing to risk everything. So what exactly happened during that final phone call? Did Charles threaten her directly, or was it an emotional plea from a man who feared for the survival of the House of Windsor? Did Diana record the conversation, as she had done in the past with her confessional tapes? And perhaps most hauntingly, could this phone call be connected in any way to the tragedy that followed just hours later? To piece this story together, we will explore never-before-revealed accounts from royal insiders, retired security officers, former journalists, and those closest to Diana in her final days. We'll analyze her state of mind in the weeks leading up to her death, her increasing paranoia about being watched, her belief that her car was being tampered with, her desperation to protect her sons from the very system she had once been a part of. We will also dissect Charles's mindset at the time, his growing anxiety about public perception, his efforts to rehabilitate Camilla's image, and the whispers within the palace that Diana was becoming a problem that needed to be handled. This is not a simple tale of love gone sour. It is a high-stakes political drama, one where reputation, power, and survival all hung in the balance. It is a story about what happens when one woman dares to speak truth to power, and how power responds when cornered. In this video, we'll walk you through the stunning details of Diana's final days, examine the secrets she planned to reveal, and break down the dramatic phone call that may have sealed her fate. We will challenge the official timeline. We will raise the questions the public has long been discouraged from asking. And by the end, you'll understand why this single phone call, hidden for decades, might be the most important and most terrifying conversation ever held within the royal sphere. But before we dive deeper, take a moment to reflect. What kind of secrets could drive a man like Charles to plead for silence? What was Diana planning to expose that was so dangerous, so volatile, that it couldn't see the light of day? And if these secrets were so threatening, what really happened after that call ended? Keep watching, because everything you think you know about Diana's final hours is about to change. When Diana Spencer officially divorced Prince Charles on August 28, 1996, it marked more than the end of a broken marriage. It was the beginning of a dramatic metamorphosis, one that would terrify the British establishment and captivate the global public. Freed from the suffocating protocols of the royal household, Diana began shedding her royal image, brick by brick, revealing a far more complex and powerful version of herself. For the monarchy, she was no longer a controllable figurehead. She had become a rogue symbol, one capable of reshaping the very narrative that Buckingham Palace worked so hard to curate. In the year following the divorce, Diana moved deliberately, crafting a new identity that centered on empowerment, humanitarianism, and strategic self-reinvention. No longer was she the naive teenager who had walked down the aisle at St. Paul's Cathedral in 1981, clutching a bouquet and a set of expectations she never agreed to. Now she was a global figure in her own right, a woman determined to define her own legacy. To the British public, she was blossoming. The media documented her every step, not with the condescension reserved for a disgraced royal, but with the awe typically afforded to cultural icons. She began attending high-profile charity events not as a royal obligation, but as an autonomous agent of change. Her involvement in landmine awareness, her visits to AIDS hospices, and her connection with war orphans across continents drew headlines that weren't centered on drama, but on hope. And this, more than anything, is what rattled the monarchy. Diana no longer needed them to remain relevant. In private, however, there was something much more calculated at play. Diana wasn't merely embracing humanitarian work out of compassion, though that was genuine. She was also redefining her political capital. She had learned over the years how to manipulate the media to her advantage, how to plant stories, how to read public mood and respond with precise action. Having been burned repeatedly by palace-sanctioned leaks and false narratives, Diana no longer played defense. She went on the offensive. Sources close to her at the time spoke of her keeping meticulous records. Conversations, timelines, press contacts. She had become her own press officer, strategist, and intelligence analyst. She knew who within the palace was leaking to which tabloids, and she used that information to shape counter-narratives. Her alliances with sympathetic journalists weren't casual. They were tactical. She would invite a reporter to lunch not simply to chat, but to shift the narrative arc of her public image. Behind the scenes, Diana began to seriously question the architecture of the monarchy itself. Her time inside the firm had shown her just how manufactured the public image of royalty could be. The charitable smiles, the choreographed events, the carefully planned statements, they were all part of a well-oiled machine designed to preserve an illusion of benevolence and tradition. Diana saw the cracks, and she wanted to expose them. Her growing independence also extended to her personal life. The public fixation on her relationship with Dodi Al-Fayed was not just about romance. It was symbolic. Dodi, the son of Egyptian billionaire Mohammed Al-Fayed, represented everything the royal establishment feared: foreign wealth, Muslim identity, and media power. To Diana's critics within the royal circles, the relationship wasn't simply inappropriate, it was threatening. A future in which Diana, mother to the future king, could potentially marry a man outside of British aristocracy and worse, one seen as politically inconvenient, was unfathomable to traditionalists. But Diana didn't care. She had stopped asking for permission. Her vacation on Mohammed Al-Fayed's yacht with Dodi was no accident. It was a global statement. She had escaped the golden cage, and she was no longer bound by anyone's expectations. The imagery was potent: Diana in a swimsuit on a sun-drenched yacht, far away from the gray, guarded courtyards of Kensington Palace. She had broken free, and the world was watching. Her wardrobe changed. Gone were the pastel dresses and demure blouses. In their place were sleek suits, bold colors, and outfits that screamed confidence rather than compliance. Her hairstyle became sharper, her gaze more direct. Paparazzi photos from that period captured a Diana who seemed more alive than she had in years. But beneath that freedom was a rising tension, one that she was acutely aware of. In interviews with close friends and confidants, Diana had begun to express concern for her safety. She told those around her that her phone was being tapped, that she believed her car was being followed, and that she had reason to think she was under surveillance. These weren't delusions. Diana had, after all, been subjected to years of institutional gaslighting. She had learned that her instincts often proved correct. She even wrote a note, later revealed to be in the possession of her lawyer, which stated, "This phase in my life is the most dangerous. My husband is planning an accident in my car. Brake failure and serious head injury in order to make the path clear for him to marry." The note was chilling, not only for its content, but for the clarity and certainty with which it was written. Diana wasn't speculating. She was forecasting. It was around this time that Diana reportedly began compiling what insiders referred to as the insurance files. These included tapes, letters, and documents that chronicled her experiences within the royal family, everything from personal betrayals to political compromises. Some say the files contained references to questionable financial transactions involving royal charities. Others believe she had documentation regarding the palace's connections with powerful media tycoons and foreign interests. There were also whispers that Diana had intended to sit down for another major interview, one that would go far beyond what she had revealed in her BBC Panorama appearance. In that interview, she had famously said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded," a reference to Charles's ongoing relationship with Camilla. But what if she had more to say? What if that was just the tip of the iceberg? According to a journalist who had briefly consulted with Diana during this period, the former princess had considered revealing damaging information not just about Charles, but about the monarchy's broader treatment of women, about the quiet institutional cruelty that existed behind the walls of privilege. She wanted the world to understand that the crown wasn't merely a symbol of national pride. It was a fortress of manipulation, where image trumped truth and loyalty was rewarded with silence. Her relationship with her sons was also undergoing a transformation. Now that she was free from royal protocol, she could parent on her own terms. She spent time with William and Harry not just as a mother, but as a mentor, determined to show them the value of authenticity over obligation. She spoke to them frankly about media manipulation, about emotional resilience, about choosing kindness over conformity. But even as she found solace in her children and confidence in her newfound independence, Diana knew she was playing a dangerous game. She was positioning herself not just outside of the royal family, but in direct opposition to it. And she understood that there would be consequences. Some insiders claim that Diana began receiving anonymous warnings during this time, calls that dropped into silence, vehicles parked near her residence for hours, strange interference on her landlines. Whether these were paranoid interpretations or coordinated intimidation remains unclear. What is certain is that Diana lived her final year with the conviction that someone, somewhere, wanted to silence her. This is the backdrop against which that final phone call to Charles must be understood. Diana wasn't a powerless ex-royal reaching out in desperation. She was a woman at the height of her clarity and determination. She had seen the mask behind the monarchy, and she was ready to tear it off. The transformation she underwent after her divorce was not a reinvention, it was a revelation. The world began to see the real Diana, fearless, flawed, brilliant, and unwilling to be reduced to a footnote in royal history. And the closer she came to revealing the truth she held, the more dangerous she became to those who had once sought to use her image to sustain the crown. Her independence was never about isolation. It was about liberation. And that liberation, while inspiring to millions, may have made her an enemy to the very institution that once called her their future queen. As Princess Diana distanced herself from the royal family, her access to the monarchy's inner workings remained unusually intact. She had not only lived within the most tightly guarded institution in Britain for over a decade, but she had observed, with growing unease, the unspoken rules, the concealed relationships, and the relentless obsession with optics that governed the lives of those behind palace walls. Her divorce may have severed her title, but it had not erased her knowledge. If anything, her departure from royal life had made her more dangerous. She now had motive, access, and independence. And most concerning of all for the palace, she had the audience. In conversations with journalists, confidants, and close friends, Diana had begun to suggest that she was sitting on a trove of information, truths she had collected during her years as Princess of Wales. She had always been an outsider in the aristocratic system, and this made her observant. She listened when others thought she wasn't paying attention. She took mental notes when hushed conversations echoed through palace hallways. And in the last 2 years of her life, she began recording these details in both literal and metaphorical terms. It was well known that Diana kept personal journals. But according to insiders, she also maintained a private cache of letters, notes, and documents that she referred to as her insurance. These items were reportedly kept in multiple locations, including with her butler Paul Burrell, who would later claim to have held onto items of immense sensitivity. There were also suggestions she had shared copies of these records with trusted legal advisors abroad, perhaps in the United States, or even with Mohammed Al-Fayed's network of international attorneys. This wasn't simple paranoia. Diana had grown convinced that the threats to her safety were not just theoretical. She once famously told a confidant, "If something happens to me, the system will say it was an accident, but I'll know better." The secrets she allegedly guarded touched on multiple areas of concern. Some were deeply personal, others were political, but all had the potential to be explosive if exposed. One of the most heavily whispered revelations concerned the financial dealings within royal charities. Diana had long been suspicious of how money was allocated, particularly regarding which organizations received large donations and how administrative funds were reported. She knew from experience that some royal-sponsored foundations had become less about charity and more about influence peddling. There were instances, she believed, in which funds meant for humanitarian relief were diverted to bolster the image of certain family members or maintain long-term relationships with elite patrons. She had expressed interest in working with independent auditors and had even considered giving a public statement about transparency in philanthropic institutions. The palace, she knew, would see that as a direct shot across the bow. Another sensitive area involved the private lives of senior royals. Diana had once told a friend that the monarchy runs on secrets. During her years in the family, she had been made privy to more than just Charles's long-standing affair with Camilla. She was aware of rumored extramarital relationships involving other royal figures, affairs that, if revealed, could undermine the moral narrative the palace tried so hard to maintain. Diana didn't intend to destroy reputations for revenge, but she did believe the public had a right to know how different the private faces of the royals were from the ones they showed the world. More troubling still were Diana's alleged insights into the royal family's relationship with Britain's intelligence services. Multiple reports from the late 1990s suggest that Diana believed she had been placed under surveillance by MI5 and possibly MI6. She had mentioned discovering bugging devices, strange clicks on her phone line, and even peculiar patterns in the media stories that seemed to preemptively undercut statements she had yet to make. She reportedly told her lawyer that she believed forces larger than the palace were trying to shape her public narrative. If Diana had gathered proof of surveillance, especially state-backed efforts to monitor or discredit her, she would have had leverage against both the monarchy and the government. There were also implications that Diana had sensitive information related to international diplomacy. Having traveled extensively and formed relationships with global leaders, Diana had moved in circles where conversations turned to geopolitical realities. Her work with landmine victims, for example, brought her into direct tension with powerful defense contractors and foreign policy architects. When she walked through an Angolan minefield in January 1997, she wasn't just making a humanitarian statement. She was undermining billion-dollar defense deals. One British minister allegedly referred to her campaign as deeply unhelpful in classified communication. Diana was aware of this. She reportedly told one friend, "I know I'm stepping on toes. The kind of toes that wear steel boots." Her potential marriage to Dodi Al-Fayed also raised alarms. In the weeks leading up to their deaths, speculation had mounted that Diana and Dodi were planning to marry. If true, this would have represented a nightmare scenario for Buckingham Palace. Diana, the mother of the future king, marrying a Muslim man of Egyptian descent, would have symbolically shattered centuries of British royal tradition and ignited cultural tensions the palace was unprepared to manage. But beyond symbolic fears, there were legal and dynastic implications. Had she married Dodi and retained custody rights or influence over William and Harry, the monarchy would have found itself entangled in a diplomatic web that extended well beyond its control. It's also been suggested that Diana was working on a tell-all book. Although the infamous Andrew Morton biography, published in 1992, had already revealed personal details about her marriage and emotional struggles, sources close to Diana claimed she had plans for a follow-up, one that would focus less on personal grievances and more on institutional criticism. She had reportedly begun mapping out themes: monarchy and mental health, the royal family's aversion to emotional vulnerability, its prioritization of image over integrity, and the quiet deals struck with media barons to protect certain members of the family while sacrificing others. Diana believed that the British press had become a tool for royal damage control, and she had stories to prove it. One incident she referenced multiple times involved the deliberate leaking of her private medical history during the height of her struggles with bulimia. According to Diana, this leak was orchestrated by palace insiders to discredit her during a period when her popularity was surging. She believed that by painting her as unstable, the institution could diminish the impact of her public advocacy. She wanted to name names. There were rumors she had video evidence as well, surveillance footage, home videos, and possibly even covert recordings of conversations with palace aides. These materials, if they existed, were said to be stored with trusted allies outside of Britain. Some believe that Diana had shared such evidence with news outlets under strict embargo agreements, to be released only if specific conditions were met, such as her death under suspicious circumstances. While no such footage has ever publicly surfaced, the possibility continues to cast a long shadow. Her butler, Paul Burrell, would later say that Diana was in possession of what he called a Pandora's box of secrets. He claimed to have held on to letters and tapes that detailed conversations with members of the royal household, conversations that revealed how little concern there was for her mental well-being or public dignity. He described a culture of emotional neglect and calculated manipulation. According to Burrell, Diana feared that the monarchy was willing to erase her, figuratively or literally, if she stepped too far out of line. And then there was her belief that she was being hunted. She had taken to driving her own car to avoid potential tampering. She changed her routines regularly. She kept certain conversations limited to handwritten notes rather than phone calls. These weren't the actions of someone suffering from delusion. They were the strategies of a woman who understood how power operates when it feels threatened. In the weeks before her death, Diana made a series of calls and visits that, in retrospect, seemed to point toward a final, fateful disclosure. She met with journalists, she contacted attorneys, and she discussed plans for a public statement, one that would change everything, according to someone close to her. What that statement would have contained remains a mystery, but what is clear is that Diana was building towards something larger than herself. She was not content to be remembered as the tragic, romantic figure the monarchy preferred. She wanted to be seen as a truth-teller, a breaker of illusions. And if she had lived longer, there is every reason to believe she would have revealed a story that threatened the very foundations of the institution she had once been destined to uphold. This is what made her so dangerous. Not her charm, not her popularity, but her knowledge. Diana knew too much. And unlike others who had exited the royal stage quietly, She was preparing to speak. Loudly, publicly, irrevocably. And then, she was gone. On the surface, it was just a phone call, one of many that took place between former spouses navigating a complicated post-divorce world. But to those close to the royal household, and to the few who knew what was actually said during that particular late-night conversation, this phone call was anything but ordinary. In fact, it may have been one of the final desperate efforts by Princess Diana to reach Charles, not out of affection or reconciliation, but out of genuine alarm. It was a warning, one that she hoped he would heed, and one that, tragically, would go unheeded. The timeline leading up to the call is as telling as the call itself. In the weeks before her untimely death, Diana had been growing increasingly paranoid, or so it seemed to some. Others, particularly those within her tight circle of confidants, didn't see paranoia. They saw a woman under surveillance, constantly followed, her private conversations often leaking to the press with disturbing accuracy. Her trusted friend and healer, Simone Simmons, had noted how Diana had become increasingly wary, often checking her surroundings, sweeping her apartment for bugs, and refusing to speak on the phone unless absolutely necessary. But then something changed. Diana, usually careful, chose to make one final call. It was late August 1997, just a handful of days before her fatal crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. The man on the other end of the line was Prince Charles. And what Diana told him would later become the subject of frenzied speculation and hushed whispers among royal insiders. Several reports, though never officially confirmed by the palace, indicate that Diana called Charles to deliver an urgent message. She had reason to believe that her life was in danger, not from random paparazzi or rogue stalkers, but from forces within or close to the establishment. She was blunt. She didn't hide behind pleasantries. According to leaked testimony from an individual who claims to have been briefed on the contents of the call, Diana told Charles that there were plans in motion to remove her permanently. Charles, reportedly taken aback by the intensity of the call, dismissed her warnings. He believed she was overreacting. In his view, Diana had become increasingly emotional and unpredictable, consumed by conspiracy theories and growing resentment. He attempted to calm her, perhaps even patronized her, insisting she was safe and that no such threat existed. But Diana was not calling for comfort. She was calling because she believed she had run out of people to trust, and, for better or worse, Charles was still the father of her children. She hoped that would mean something. Those closest to Diana would later say she felt unheard. She had tried warning others. She had spoken with her bodyguards, her lawyer, and even the press in veiled comments. But each time, her concerns were minimized or conveniently reframed as the delusions of a scorned ex-royal. This phone call to Charles, then, was not just about her own safety. It was about her son's. She wanted to make sure that if anything happened to her, they would know she had tried to prevent it, that she had sounded the alarm. The call lasted approximately 10 minutes, though exact details vary depending on the source. What is consistently reported, however, is that Diana ended the call by telling Charles, "You may not believe me now, but you'll remember this when I'm gone." Those words, chilling in hindsight, have become legendary among royal biographers and journalists. They were not vague poetic musings. They were specific, intentional, and heavy with implication. In the days that followed, Diana appeared both anxious and resolved. She continued her vacation with Dodi Al-Fayed, traveling from the Mediterranean to Paris. But she also made additional phone calls, this time to her solicitor, Lord Mishkin, and to her spiritual advisor. Each conversation seemed to repeat the same concern. She was being watched, and someone wanted her silenced. What made the call to Charles so unique was that it breached the wall of royal separation. Diana had effectively crossed the invisible boundary by directly involving the future king in a narrative that, if true, could implicate individuals close to the royal machine. Some royal watchers believe Charles didn't take the call seriously because he had heard versions of this concern before. Diana had confided in him in the past, particularly during their separation, about her fears of being targeted. But this time, the urgency was different. This wasn't about palace courtiers leaking to tabloids or security details being replaced without explanation. This was about life and death. Years later, journalist Paul Burrell would state in his own controversial memoir that Diana had been in possession of a note, handwritten by her, that stated she believed she would be killed in a car crash. That note was allegedly written months before her death and sealed in an envelope labeled for safekeeping. The content of that note eerily mirrored what she conveyed during her final call with Charles, that she would not die by accident, and that the plan to end her life would be carried out in a way that appeared plausible, perhaps even convenient. When news broke of her death on August 31, 1997, Charles reportedly remained calm. Some have interpreted his initial composure as shock. Others, more critically, saw it as calculated detachment. But what cannot be dismissed is the undeniable fact that Charles had been warned, days earlier, by the very woman who had just died in a high-speed crash under suspicious circumstances. The royal family's response in the hours and days that followed further deepened public distrust. There was a prolonged delay in issuing a public statement. Flags at royal residences remained at full mast. The Queen and Charles stayed at Balmoral with William and Harry, insulating themselves from the media storm. Critics saw this as cold and distant. Supporters claimed it was necessary to protect the children. But behind the scenes, a different conversation was taking place, one that revolved around the phone call and whether Diana had indeed left behind evidence that would validate her final warning. In private, it is said that Charles was deeply rattled. According to a source close to one of his aides, Charles made a discreet inquiry into whether Diana had shared any information with members of the press or her legal team before leaving for France. He was particularly concerned about whether tapes or letters had been handed over to journalists. The existence of such material would not only vindicate Diana's fears but could also expose others within the monarchy to scrutiny. The question remains, why didn't Charles act on Diana's warning? One theory suggests he didn't believe her. Another, more disturbing possibility is that he did believe her but felt powerless or unwilling to intervene. To act on Diana's claims would have required Charles to publicly question the very institution that had molded him since birth. It would have required him to investigate his own courtiers, challenge his own security apparatus, and open the door to scandals that could permanently damage the monarchy. Moreover, Charles had spent years distancing himself from Diana's public persona. She had eclipsed him in popularity. Her humanitarian work had turned her into a global icon, while he was often portrayed as cold and aloof. Acknowledging her fears would mean validating her. And at that point, the palace was more interested in protecting the continuity of the crown than rehabilitating the image of its former princess. To this day, the phone call remains undocumented in official records. There are no transcripts, no recordings, only the testimony of those who say Diana told them about it. The palace, predictably, has never commented on it. But for those who believe in the darker possibilities surrounding Diana's death, the phone call stands as a critical piece of evidence. Perhaps the most direct sign that she knew what was coming and tried, in her own way, to stop it. The aftermath of Diana's death did not include any formal investigation into the contents of her final conversations. The British inquest that followed years later focused largely on the crash itself, its speed, the condition of the driver, the presence of paparazzi. But the broader context, the warnings, the surveillance claims, and the final phone call, was treated as peripheral, speculative, even conspiratorial. But for the people who knew Diana best, it was never about conspiracy. It was about credibility. They believed her because they had seen the fear in her eyes. They had read the handwritten letters. They had heard the catch in her voice when she spoke about the future she knew she might not live to see. And Charles, despite all the years of estrangement, was still the person she chose to call when it mattered most. Perhaps she believed that, deep down, he would understand. Perhaps she hoped he still cared enough to protect her. Or perhaps it was simply a last-ditch attempt to record her fear with someone who would remember. Because memory is a powerful thing. And though Diana's voice was silenced that night in Paris, the words she spoke over that phone line, words that only Charles truly heard, may yet outlive the silence that followed. From the outside, Prince William was the embodiment of duty, polished in manner, principled in character, and perfectly groomed to one day ascend the throne. For decades, he carried the burden of legacy with grace, a royal heir navigating the treacherous waters of public expectation and private grief. But beneath the composed surface lay a man haunted by questions. Questions about his mother, her death, and the whispers that had followed him into adulthood like shadows on a long walk. At the heart of these whispers was the suspicion that the truth surrounding Princess Diana's tragic end had never been fully revealed. And as William matured into a man and a father, those questions refused to stay buried. For many years, William had been shielded from the darkest implications of his mother's death. The official version, drunk driver, reckless paparazzi, a tragic accident in a Paris tunnel, was the story he was told, the one everyone clung to. It was simple, tragic, and allowed the royal family to move forward without the taint of scandal. But simplicity is often the enemy of truth. And William, with his mother's inquisitive nature and his father's understanding of the machinery of power, began to sense the gaps in the story. His journey into the past didn't begin with a single moment of revelation. Instead, it was a slow, creeping curiosity, intensified by age, fatherhood, and the passage of time. The older he grew, the more William saw reflections of Diana in himself and in his children. Her absence, once a sharp pain, evolved into a persistent ache. With that ache came the urge to understand not just who she was, but what truly happened to her. It was no longer enough to remember her smile or repeat the media-approved narrative. He needed to know why a woman so loved, so globally adored, and so cautious in her final weeks could have died in such a chaotic and unprotected manner. One of the earliest signs of William's private investigation came in his quiet meetings with some of Diana's former staff, people who had been dismissed, sidelined, or simply faded into the background after her death. Among them was Paul Burrell, her former butler, who had controversially retained many of her personal belongings and claimed knowledge of her innermost thoughts. Though publicly William and Harry once condemned Burrell for exploiting their mother's legacy, privately, William began reaching out. According to palace insiders who spoke under anonymity, William requested several meetings with Burrell and two of Diana's former protection officers in the years between 2015 and 2019. These meetings were held discreetly, sometimes abroad, sometimes in private residences under heavy security. The purpose was always the same: to collect facts, to hear first-hand accounts, and to fill the silence left by years of avoidance. What William learned began to unsettle him. Burrell had never wavered in his claim that Diana believed she was being followed, surveilled, and targeted. He shared with William letters Diana had written in which she expressed her belief that someone was planning to orchestrate her death in a car crash. These were not the dramatic thoughts of an emotionally volatile woman, but measured warnings written in clear, neat handwriting. She had even named individuals she suspected of betraying her trust. One particular piece of evidence that stayed with William was the infamous Mishkin Note. This was a document written by Lord Mishkin, Diana's solicitor, after a meeting in which Diana told him she believed someone close to the royal establishment was planning to kill her. William, reading the account firsthand, was shaken. It mirrored the phone call Charles had received just days before the crash. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a pattern. With his suspicions now rooted in tangible documents and consistent testimony, William took the extraordinary step of contacting journalists who had covered Diana's life extensively. Not all of them were cooperative. Some remained loyal to the narrative they had helped build. Others feared the implications of revisiting such dangerous ground. But a few were willing to talk. They told him about stories that were killed before publication, about pressure from palace courtiers, and about how certain tabloids were mysteriously tipped off to Diana's movements in the final week of her life. One veteran reporter shared an alarming anecdote. Days before Diana's fatal trip to Paris, she had requested a meeting but insisted it take place in a public setting. There, she warned that something was about to happen and asked the journalist to keep a record in case she didn't return. William listened to this story in silence, and when it was finished, he asked one simple question: did anyone believe her? The journalist paused before replying, "We didn't believe she'd actually die, but we knew she was scared, and we failed her." These discoveries led William to begin a private review of the crash investigation itself. In 2004, Operation Paget, a 3-year investigation by British police into conspiracy theories surrounding Diana's death, had concluded there was no evidence of foul play. But William, unsatisfied with the surface-level analysis, requested access to unredacted files. According to a source close to the investigation, William found inconsistencies in how the crash was analyzed, particularly in the handling of CCTV footage, the behavior of French emergency services, and the questionable background of driver Henri Paul. Even more unsettling were the unanswered questions around the missing CCTV footage from the tunnel, and why none of the cameras appeared to be functioning at the time of the crash. This, coupled with Henri Paul's questionable blood alcohol level, disputed by independent tests, only deepened William's skepticism. Privately, he spoke with Harry about his findings. At first, Harry was reluctant. He had built a new life far from royal constraints and was wary of being pulled back into the family's darkest episode. But eventually, he agreed to join the effort. Together, the brothers compared notes, arranged interviews, and reviewed the few remaining artifacts from Diana's final days. They read her letters, watched her interviews, and spoke with her closest friends. One name that kept surfacing was Dodi Al-Fayed's father, Mohammed Al-Fayed. The billionaire had long maintained that the crash was not accidental. Dismissed for years as a grieving father grasping at conspiracies, Mohammed had compiled his own dossier of evidence and had even taken legal action in multiple jurisdictions to force investigations. William, with Harry at his side, arranged a private meeting with Mohammed in Switzerland. That meeting, by all accounts, was somber and emotional. Mohammed showed the princes everything he had collected: surveillance photographs, hotel security logs, witness statements, and transcripts. Much of it had been dismissed or deemed inadmissible in court, but for William, it painted a disturbing portrait. It revealed a campaign of surveillance, inconsistencies in official testimony, and the unmistakable sense that Diana had been boxed in, cornered, and ultimately left vulnerable. When William returned to London, he brought with him copies of documents and a renewed resolve. He began to question individuals within the current royal security apparatus. Not aggressively, but persistently. He wanted to know why Diana's security had been withdrawn in the weeks before her death. He asked why the palace had not intervened when Diana reported her fears. Most of all, he wanted to understand who made the decisions that left her exposed. There were no clear answers. Only vague explanations, bureaucratic justifications, and shifting responsibility. William, trained in diplomacy and subtle pressure, kept pushing. Eventually, a retired security chief confessed in private that the decision to pull Diana's close protection detail had been encouraged by figures who wanted to separate her from royal life permanently. While not an admission of intent to harm, it was an acknowledgement that her vulnerability was no accident, it was orchestrated. For William, this was the final confirmation he needed. The truth was not that Diana had been killed in an elaborate assassination plot with dramatic explosions and secret agents. The truth was quieter, but no less sinister. Diana had been left unprotected, knowing she was in danger, begging to be heard, and no one listened. This realization changed William. It deepened his resolve to protect his own family, to ensure no one under his watch would ever be silenced the way his mother was. It also changed his relationship with the institution he was born into. Though still outwardly loyal, William began carving his own path, one marked by modernity, independence, and quiet resistance. He refused to let his children be controlled by palace handlers. He selected advisors outside of the traditional royal inner circle. He started making decisions not based on protocol, but on principle. And though he never publicly spoke of the investigation, those close to him say his entire demeanor shifted in the aftermath. He was no longer just a royal. He was a son searching for justice and perhaps, in his own way, beginning to find it. This private mission for truth would eventually collide with public revelations. Documents sealed for decades would be challenged. Witnesses once silenced would begin to speak. And William, standing at the center of the storm, would be forced to make a choice between silence and revelation. But that moment had not yet come. For now, he carried the truth with him, heavy but necessary. The truth of a mother's warning. The truth of a call that went unanswered. And the truth that justice, though long delayed, might still be within reach. In the long corridors of Kensington Palace, whispers had long danced like shadows, murmuring stories of lineage, doubt, and unanswered questions. These murmurs had always existed, buried beneath tradition and protocol, dismissed as the murky talk of tabloids or the fever dreams of conspiracy theorists. Yet behind closed doors, those whispers had grown louder over the years, so much so that they eventually reached the ears of the one person least prepared to hear them, Prince William. The British royal family has always clung fiercely to the sanctity of bloodlines. The idea that succession flows through unbroken ancestral streams is not just ceremonial, it is the very foundation of monarchy. Without lineage, there is no crown. So when evidence emerged suggesting that Prince William might not be the biological son of King Charles, it did not just threaten to upend a family, it threatened to undermine the very legitimacy of the House of Windsor. The origins of the speculation were rooted decades in the past. In the years after Diana's death, tabloids frequently speculated about her closeness with James Hewitt, the former cavalry officer with whom she had an admitted affair. Although both Hewitt and Diana maintained that the relationship began after William's birth, public fascination with the timing persisted. Photographs comparing facial features, leaked letters, and off-the-record comments from palace insiders fueled the rumor mill. For William, this was never more than noise. Until it wasn't. It began with an anonymous envelope delivered to a trusted advisor, not to William directly, but to a man who had served as one of his private secretaries for over a decade. Inside the envelope was a short, typed message. The truth about the bloodline lies in the DNA. The truth has been known, but never spoken. Attached was a scanned copy of what appeared to be a heavily redacted laboratory report. The details were murky, the origins unclear, but the implication was unmistakable. Initially, the advisor debated whether to bring the document to William's attention at all. The potential damage, personal, emotional, constitutional, was immense. But ultimately, his loyalty to William and the severity of the implications compelled him to act. He placed the document in a secure envelope, accompanied by a handwritten note. For your eyes only. Urgent. William's first reaction was one of disbelief. He read the contents of the document with furrowed brows, quietly mouthing the words to himself. The document claimed to be a comparative analysis between a stored DNA sample labeled as Prince William and another labeled King Charles. The report, though partially obscured, suggested inconsistencies, markers that did not align as they should between a father and biological son. His hands trembled. For a long moment, he sat in silence. Then he stood up, walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, and stared out blankly. The whisper that had always lurked behind smiles and formal dinners was now in front of him, typed in black and white. The first step was verification. William knew better than to trust an anonymous letter, no matter how detailed. He reached out to a discreet contact in the medical field, an old university friend who had risen through the ranks of genetic research and now worked for one of the UK's top private laboratories. Without disclosing his identity, William arranged for a personal DNA test. The sample collection was conducted in private, without intermediaries. He submitted 2 samples, his own and one labeled from the official archives. A medical vial obtained with help from a royal physician who had long suspected the truth and quietly preserved the material. The results took weeks. During that time, William withdrew emotionally from even those closest to him. Catherine noticed the shift, as did his aides. His appetite waned. His patience shortened. He canceled engagements. At times, he would be found pacing his private library, clutching the envelope like a lifeline. His thoughts spiraled into worst-case scenarios. If the rumors were true, if he was not Charles's biological son, what would it mean for him, his children, the monarchy itself? And then the results arrived. They were definitive. The analysis confirmed that there was less than a 10% probability that King Charles was William's biological father. In contrast, markers consistent with another individual, James Hewitt, were found to be significantly closer. This was no longer speculation. It was science. William's world, once anchored in ceremony and certainty, began to tilt. The truths he had accepted from childhood, his father's guidance, his role as heir, the reverence with which he carried his mother's name, now felt unmoored. More than just betrayal, there was a profound sense of displacement. Who was he, if not the legitimate heir to the throne? What did that make his children? Would the public accept him if they knew? Would Parliament? He confronted the physician who had helped secure the archival DNA sample. The physician, older now and burdened by years of silence, explained that this knowledge had been known by a select few for some time. There had always been rumors within the royal medical circle. Certain blood samples never quite aligned. But the implications were too great. To speak the truth could have triggered a constitutional crisis. So silence prevailed. William was furious. Not just at the physician, but at the entire apparatus that had allowed such a deception to persist. He saw the royal family not as a sanctuary of tradition, but as a fortress of secrets. The walls he had once defended now looked like barriers to the truth. He confronted Charles. The meeting was held in private, without aides, phones, or recording devices. Just the two of them, seated across from one another in the drawing room of Highgrove House. William placed the report on the table between them and asked one question. Did you know? Charles was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. The admission came not with anger, but with weariness. Charles explained that he had long suspected the possibility, particularly during the final years of his marriage to Diana. But love, duty, and public image had compelled him to raise William as his own, to embrace the role of father with the hope that lineage didn't matter as much as loyalty. He had grown to love William not because of biology, but because he saw in him the best parts of Diana and the nobility of leadership. But for William, the knowledge that Charles had known and said nothing felt like betrayal layered upon betrayal. Not only had the truth been hidden from him, but it had been manipulated to serve an institution that valued image above identity. The following weeks were a storm of conflicting emotions. William considered walking away from the line of succession, from the duties, from the very foundation of the monarchy. But then he looked at his children, George, Charlotte, Louis, and realized that their futures were still shaped by the decisions he made now. The blood that ran through them, regardless of royal title, was his. And while he might not be Charles's son by birth, he was his own man, forged by choices, not chromosomes. He confided in Catherine, who was devastated by the revelation but supportive. Together, they weighed the risks of public disclosure. To go public meant inviting chaos, media frenzy, constitutional inquiry, potential abdication. But to remain silent meant perpetuating the same secrecy that had shattered him. He also informed Harry, whose reaction was more explosive. Already estranged from the institution, Harry saw the revelation as the final confirmation of everything he had suspected about the family's duplicity. But it also made him question his own origins, his own legitimacy. The brothers, though often divided, shared a quiet evening processing the implications. It was the most honest conversation they had had in years. In secret, William began consulting constitutional scholars. Could a person not of royal blood be king? Technically, Parliament could validate any heir, as long as the public supported the decision. But public support was fickle, and the institution was built on precedent. He also reached out to the Prime Minister confidentially. In a private meeting at Chequers, he laid out the situation. The Prime Minister, though shocked, assured him that continuity and public stability mattered more than DNA. The monarchy, after all, was not a science, it was a story, one the public had chosen to believe in. And if William continued to act with integrity and honor, the people would follow him, not his bloodline. Still, William couldn't shake the unease. A new reality had emerged, and no matter how carefully he navigated it, the foundation beneath his feet would never be the same. He instructed his legal team to secure all documents, test results, and communications in a sealed archive to be made available at a time of his choosing or in the event of his death. He also made arrangements for a secondary statement to be issued in the event that the information was leaked. It would be dignified, calm, and rooted in love for the country. But it would also be truthful. For now, the truth remained known only to a handful of people. But truth, like water, finds its way through cracks. And William knew it was only a matter of time before the secret that had rocked his identity would reach the ears of the world. He was no longer just the heir. He was a man who had uncovered a hidden chapter of royal history and who now stood at the crossroads between silence and revelation. When the truth about Prince William's DNA results began to circulate through the inner sanctums of Buckingham Palace, it hit like a thunderclap in a summer sky, unexpected, jarring, and impossible to ignore. The corridors that once echoed with ceremonial processions and gentle courtly laughter now reverberated with a tension so thick it clung to the air like fog. Rumors, always a staple of royal life, had turned into substantiated facts. The revelations that had once been confined to back-alley gossip columns were now firmly entrenched within palace walls, carried on hushed lips and panicked whispers. The first to officially learn of the DNA results within the palace, outside of William and Charles themselves, was Queen Camilla. She received the information not through a personal admission from her husband, but rather from a senior royal aide who had been briefed directly by William's legal counsel. It was a calculated move, made not out of trust, but necessity. The news was too volatile to remain buried, and the palace's communications office needed to be prepared. For Queen Camilla, the timing couldn't have been worse. Already contending with public skepticism over her position as queen consort, the revelation that Charles was not William's biological father was a dagger aimed directly at the fragile legitimacy of the royal hierarchy. Her reaction was instantaneous and explosive. According to those present during the confrontation that followed, Queen Camilla stormed into Charles's private study in Clarence House, eyes blazing, cheeks flushed with rage. Slamming the door behind her, she demanded answers, not just for herself, but for what she believed was the integrity of the crown. "You knew," she reportedly spat, pointing a trembling finger at her husband. "You knew, And you allowed this lie to live. Do you have any idea what you've done? Charles, by then emotionally exhausted from his recent confrontation with William, tried to maintain composure. He admitted that he had long suspected the truth but had convinced himself it didn't matter, that William was his son in every way that counted. But Camilla was unmoved. For her, this wasn't just about paternity. It was about control, legacy, and the calculated deception that now threatened to engulf them all. Her anger was not born solely from betrayal, but from the fear of what this meant for the monarchy. Camilla had spent years clawing her way from reviled mistress to accepted queen consort. She had endured public scorn, vile headlines, and even death threats to stand beside Charles. And now, in what should have been the twilight of their reign, a seismic revelation threatened to undo all of it. Inside the palace, lines were quickly drawn. Some senior courtiers, particularly those aligned with the more traditionalist factions of the monarchy, believed that the matter should be immediately contained. Their logic was simple. The monarchy was based on continuity, not biological precision. The public needed a figurehead, not a paternity test. Their suggestion was to bury the results, as had been done with other inconvenient truths over the centuries, and allow the institution to move forward unscathed. But others weren't so sure. Among the younger generation of staffers, and even a few progressive royals, there was a growing sentiment that transparency was not only necessary, it was inevitable. The world had changed. Secrets no longer stayed secret. The palace could no longer rely on backroom deals and tightly controlled press statements. If the public were to learn the truth, and there was every indication that leaks were imminent, it would be far better for the palace to get ahead of the story than be buried under its weight. Camilla, however, was adamant. No public statement, no acknowledgement, no deviation from the official line that Charles was William's father, full stop. She argued that anything less would invite chaos. "Do you want to end this family?" she reportedly shouted at a strategy meeting with senior advisors. "Do you want to give Harry and Meghan the ammunition to burn us all down? Because that's what you're doing." Her words rang heavy. While she might not have said it explicitly, her implication was clear. The monarchy was already under siege. With the Duke and Duchess of Sussex continuing to lob grenades from across the Atlantic, the institution had been waging a quiet war on multiple fronts. And now, just as they were regaining their footing after years of scandal and infighting, the very legitimacy of the heir to the throne was in question. Privately, Camilla lobbied Charles to take swift action. She wanted William's claim to the throne reviewed. She suggested that perhaps the line of succession needed to be adjusted. "If he's not your son," she reportedly told Charles during a heated exchange, "then he's not the next king. It's that simple." Charles refused. His voice, usually soft in private matters, was firm and resolute. "William is my son in every way that matters," he said. "And he will be king. Nothing changes that." But Camilla wasn't done fighting. She reached out to her own family, namely her son, Tom Parker Bowles, and daughter, Laura Lopez. Camilla believed they, too, had a stake in the royal future. She had always hoped that her children, though not royals themselves, would benefit from her ascension to queen. The scandal now threatened not only her title, but any legacy she had hoped to pass down. In private conversations, she expressed deep bitterness that everything she had sacrificed, her reputation, her privacy, even her safety, was now being undone by a truth that had been buried for decades. And she didn't keep her bitterness confined to whispers. Camilla began pushing back through informal channels. She leveraged relationships with certain right-leaning columnists and editors, encouraging them to cast doubt on the DNA reports. Stories began surfacing in niche publications suggesting that the test results could have been forged, that the samples might have been tampered with, or even that foreign agents had planted the information to destabilize the monarchy.